The cranial meninges are three connective tissue layers that separate the soft tissue of the brain from the bones of the cranium. They help to enclose and protect blood vessels that supply the brain and contain and circulate cerebrospinal fluid. The meninges also help to form some of the veins that drain blood from the brain. And so, beginning with the most external, we have the dura mater, which literally means tough mother in Latin. And so this is going to be the external, dense, irregular connective tissue layer that has two fibrous layers. And so this is the strongest of the meninges. Then going more deep, we have the arachnoid mater. And so this lies external to the pia mater and internal to the dura mater. So the arachnoid mater is a delicate web of collagen and elastic fibers. And then finally, the deepest layer is the pia mater, and this is a thin layer of delicate areolar connective tissue that is highly vascularized and tightly adheres to the brain, where it follows every contour of the surface of the brain. Next, we have the ventricles of the brain, and these are going to be cavities or expansions within the brain that are derived from embryonic neural tube development. And so the ventricles are continuous with one another as well as with the central canal of the spinal cord. And through this, we have the cerebral spinal fluid that circulates between the spinal cord and the brain. And we have four ventricles that are found within the brain. The cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF, is a clear, colorless fluid that circulates in the ventricles and bathes the exposed surfaces of the central nervous system, which it completely surrounds the brain and spinal cord. There are three main functions for CSF. The first is buoyancy, where the brain floats in the CSF and supporting more than 90% of its weight, preventing it from being crushed under the weight of the brain. Without CSF, the brain would actually sink through the foramen magnum. The second function is for protection, where the CSF provides a cushion to protect the neuronal structures from sudden movements. And so it helps to slow movements in the brain if the skull or if the body suddenly moves and in a forceful manner. And the third function is for the stability of the internal environment. And the CSF transports nutrients and chemicals to the brain and also helps to remove waste products from the brain. So it helps to protect the nervous system from chemical fluctuations that could disrupt neuron function, and especially if there are toxins that become exposed to the central nervous system. The waste products are transported to the venous circulation, and then they're filtered by the blood and secreted into the urine and excreted by the urinary system. The formation of CSF is formed by the choroid plexus in each ventricle. And the choroid plexus is composed of a layer of ependymal cells and the capillaries that lie within the pia mater. The CSF is produced by secretion of a fluid from the ependymal cells that originate from the blood plasma. The four ventricles include two lateral ventricles that are in the cerebrum, and they're separated by a thin medial partition called the septum pellucidum. And so when we look at this, this is like the ram horns of the ventricles. The third ventricle is literally called the third ventricle, and this is found within the Diencephalon and is smaller than the lateral ventricles. And then we have the fourth ventricle, and this is found between the pons and the medulla and the cerebellum. And the fourth ventricle narrows at the inferior end before it merges with the slender central canal within the spinal cord. And so all of the ventricles contain cerebrospinal fluid, where cerebrospinal fluid is actually formulated within the ventricles themselves. The blood-brain barrier, or BBB, strictly regulates what substances can enter the interstitial fluid of the brain, and it helps to keep the neurons in the brain from being completely exposed to drugs, waste products in the blood, and various levels of normal substances such as ions, hormones, and chemicals that could adversely affect the brain. The composition of the blood-brain barrier is the perivascular sheet of astrocytes that cover, wrap around, and completely envelop the capillaries in the brain. And so both the capillary endothelial cells and the astrocyte perivascular sheet are what make up the blood-brain barrier. The astrocytes are what act as the gatekeepers that permit materials to pass to the neurons after leaving the capillaries. And so we have three areas within the brain that do not have a blood-brain barrier, and this includes the choroid plexus because of the formation of cerebrospinal fluid, and the hypothalamus and the pineal gland because these produce hormones that have to be readily accessible to the bloodstream. The adult brain structure is divided into several regions, where we start with the cerebrum, and that is divided into the cerebral hemispheres, a right and a left, that is separated by longitudinal fissure. Next we have the Diencephalon, and that is sandwiched between the inferior regions of the cerebral hemispheres, and so this is found as a relay station between sensory and motor pathways. Then we have our cerebellum, and so this is going to be the second largest part of the brain, and it is found posterior to the pons and the medulla oblongata of the brainstem. And finally we have the brainstem, which connects the cerebrum to the cerebellum and to the spinal cord. For the brain topography on the outer surface, what we find is a sulcus, or sulci for plural, which is going to be the shallow depressions that are found between folds, and so these make up the grooves found within the brain. Then we have the gyrus, singular, or gyri for plural, and these are going to be the folds, or the ridges that we find. And then lastly, we have the fissures, which are going to be deep grooves, and so one good example is the separation between the right and the left hemisphere, where we have a very large fissure that separates the two. Within the cerebrum, we find two cerebral hemispheres, the right and the left, and these are separated by a deep longitudinal fissure that extends along the mid-sagittal plane. There are bundles of axons called tracts, and the largest of these white matter tracts are the corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres together. The right cerebral hemisphere controls the left side of the body, whereas the left cerebral hemisphere controls the right side of the body. The lobes of the cerebrum include the frontal lobe, which lies deep to the frontal bone and forms the anterior part of the cerebral hemisphere. It ends posteriorly at a deep groove called the central sulcus, and the inferior border of the frontal lobe is marked by the lateral sulcus, which is a deep groove that separates the frontal and parietal lobes from the temporal lobe. The frontal lobe is responsible for voluntary motor functions, concentration, verbal communication, decision-making, planning, and personality. The parietal lobe is internal to the parietal bone, and it forms the superior posterior part of each cerebral hemisphere. It ends anteriorly at the central sulcus, posteriorly at a parietal occipital sulcus, and laterally at a lateral sulcus. The parietal lobe is responsible for general sensory functions such as evaluating shapes and textures of objects that we touch. The temporal lobe lies inferiorly to the lateral sulcus and underlies the temporal bone. the temporal lobe is involved with hearing and smell. The occipital lobe forms the posterior region of each hemisphere and immediately underlies the occipital bone. This is where we have visual information and storing of visual memories that occur. And then the last lobe, the insula, is a small lobe that is deep to the lateral sulcus, and the only way to get to it is by literally pulling aside the temporal lobe. This insula is involved in memory and interpretation of taste. The two major fissures that we have are the transverse fissure and the longitudinal fissure. And again, fissure just means a deep groove, where the first, the transverse fissure, separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum and is found on the posterior side of the brain. The longitudinal fissure is going to lie along the mid-sagittal plane, and it will separate the two hemispheres into a right and a left hemisphere. Three significant sulci that we find are the central sulcus, and this separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobes, and it's found in the midpoint of the brain, and so it will separate the anterior region into the frontal lobe and then the posterior region into the parietal lobe. The parietal occipital sulcus is going to separate the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe, and then the lateral sulcus will separate the temporal and from the frontal and the parietal lobes. The major gyri, which are again the folds of the brain, include the precentral gyrus, and this is going to be the anterior to the central sulcus, and so this will be found in the frontal lobe. The postcentral gyrus is going to be posterior to the central sulcus and will be found in the parietal lobe. For the organization of the neural tissue, we have the gray matter, which houses motor neurons and interneuron cell bodies, dendrites, teleodendria, and unmyelinated axons. The white matter is derived from the color of myelin in myelinated axons. And so in general, what we have is that the gray matter tends to be the external layer, and this helps to form the cerebral cortex, where we find that the white matter is deep to the gray matter. So with the cerebral cortex, this is composed of the gray matter, which is found on the external layer of the brain. And again, the gray matter is comprised of the motor neuron and interneuron cell bodies, unmyelinated axons, dendrites, and teleodendria. And so all of these help to make up our consciousness. Within the cerebral cortex, there are several structural areas that can be divided into distinct motor and sensory functions. However, high mental functions like language and memory are found in large areas without the brain. Yet we find three functional areas that are recognized. So motor areas are used for voluntary control of motor functions. Sensory areas are to provide conscious awareness of sensation, and then associations areas are primarily integrated and store information. With the motor areas, these are found typically in the frontal lobe of the brain. And so the primary motor cortex, is also known as the somatic motor area, is found within the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. The neurons here control voluntary skeletal muscle activity, where the axons of these neurons project to the opposite side or contralaterally to the brainstem and the spinal cord, such that the left primary motor cortex controls the right voluntary muscles, and the right primary cortex controls the left side voluntary muscles. The motor homunculus is the spatial map of the body that shows the innervation of the primary motor cortex to various body parts. that is found on the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. And so this bizarre picture reflects the amount of cortex that is dedicated to the motor activity of each body part. So, for example, the hands are represented in a much larger area of the cortex than the trunk because of the amount that we use our hands, such as for precise fine motor movements, as compared to our trunk of our body. The motor speech area has also been called the Broca's area, and this is found within the inferior lateral portion of the left frontal lobe. Note, it is only on the left frontal lobe and not on the right side. This is important for controlling the muscular movements necessary for vocalization. The frontal eye field is on the superior surface of the middle frontal gyrus, which is immediately anterior to the premotor cortex. And this is responsible for controlling and regulating the eye movements needed for reading and coordinating binocular vision, or having both eyes used together. The primary somatosensory cortex is found within the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe, where neurons in this cortex receive general somatic sensory information from touch, pressure, pain, and temperature receptors, and this is what we refer to as consciously being aware of sensations received by the cortex. The sensory homunculus is very similar to that of the motor homunculus that can be traced on the postcentral gyrus on the surface, where the different areas devote the amount of sensory information within a body region. So some areas that have a lot of sensory information that's devoted to them on the postcentral gyrus include the lips, the fingers, and the genital regions, as compared to something like the trunk or the foot. The other sensory areas are found within the different parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. The primary visual cortex is found in the occipital lobe, and this receives and processes incomplete visual information. The primary auditory cortex is found in the temporal lobe and receives and processes auditory information. The primary gustatory cortex is in the insula and is involved in the processing of taste information. And the primary olfactory cortex is found in the temporal lobe, and this provides conscious awareness of smells. The association areas either process and interpret incoming data or coordinate a motor response. And so these typically integrate new sensory inputs with memories of past experiences. The premotor cortex is also known as the somatic motor association area and is found in the frontal lobe immediately anterior to the precentral gyrus. This is where there is processing of motor information and is primarily responsible for coordinating learned, skilled motor activities, such as moving the eyes in a coordinated fashion when reading a book or playing the piano. Someone who has suffered trauma to this area would still be able to understand written letters and words, but would have difficulty reading because his or her eyes could not follow the lines on a printed page. The somatosensory association area is in the parietal lobe and lies immediately posterior to the primary somatosensory cortex. It interprets sensory information and is responsible for integrating and interpreting sensations to determine the texture, temperature, pressure, and shape of an object. And so it helps us to identify objects with our eyes closed, so that if you close your eyes and put your hand into a bucket of sand, you know what would be sand, what would be rocks, and what would be other substances such as grass or weeds. The auditory association area is found within the temporal lobe and posterior and inferior to the primary auditory cortex. Within this area, the cortical neurons interpret the characteristics of sound and store memories of sound heard in the past. So this is how you can associate songs that you love versus songs that you dislike, or differences in family members from strangers when you hear their voices. The visual association area is located in the occipital lobe, and it surrounds the primary visual area, where it enables us to process visual information by analyzing color, movement, and form of objects, and to use this object in identifying the things that we see. So, for instance, when you look at a face, this is very important, especially as we're young, that we make certain associations for integrating all that information so that we're able to recognize our own mother or father from a stranger. Wernicke's area is typically located within the left hemisphere only, and it overlaps the parietal and temporal lobes. It is involved in recognizing, understanding, and comprehending spoken or written language. And so Wernicke's area and the motor speech area work together in order to identify fluent communication for that to occur. The Gnostic area is composed of regions of the parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. This region integrates all sensory, visual, and auditory information being processed by the association areas within these lobes. And so you can comprehend current activity that is occurring. So for instance, if you wake up on a Sunday morning and you smell your mom baking breakfast and your sister talking about how hungry you are and it's 8 o'clock, you know that it is breakfast time. The prefrontal cortex is found in the cerebral cortex, and it covers the frontal part of the frontal lobe. And so this is an area that is responsible for reasoning, cognition, and personality. It's not fully developed until age 25. And a lot of our social behaviors are also found associated with the prefrontal cortex area. The cerebral nuclei, or basal nuclei, are paired irregular masses of gray matter that are buried deep within the central white matter. They are found on the basal region of the cerebral hemispheres, inferior to the floor of the lateral ventricle. They are important for regulating intensity of movements, such as walking, as well as for starting and stopping of voluntary movements. The caudate nucleus is going to be a C shape that has an enlarged head and slender arching tail that parallels the swinging curve of the lateral ventricle. When a person begins to walk, the neurons in this nucleus stimulate the appropriate muscles to produce the pattern and rhythm of the arms and legs moving for walking. The amygdaloid body, or commonly just referred to as the amygdala, is an expanded region at the tail of the caudate nucleus, and it participates in the expression of emotions, controls of behavioral activities, and development of moods. The putamen and the globus pallidus are two masses of gray matter positioned between the bulging external surface of the insula and the lateral wall of the diencephalon. The lentiform nucleus is usually a compact, almost rounded mass where the putamen functions in controlling muscular movements at the subconscious level, and the globus pallidus both excites and inhibits the activities of the thalamus to control and adjust muscle tone. And the colostrum is a thin silver of gray matter that is formed by a layer of neurons located immediately internal to the cortex of the insula and derived from that cortex, where we have visual information that is processed at a subconscious level. The diencephalon is sandwiched between the inferior regions of the two cerebral hemispheres, and it is often referred to as our in-between brain. And here we find the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. The epithalamus is a structure that partially forms the posterior roof of the diencephalon and covers the third ventricle. It connects the limbic system to other parts of the brain. And so on the posterior portion, we find the pineal gland, or the pineal body, which is an endocrine gland. It secretes the hormone melatonin, and it appears to regulate day and night cycles known as our circadian rhythms. And we find the thalamus, which refers to paired oval masses of gray matter that lie on each side of the third ventricle. The thalamus forms the superior lateral walls of the third ventricle. It is the principal and final relay point for sensory information that will be processed and projected to the primary somatosensory cortex. Only a relative small portion of the sensory information that we receive actually arrives to the thalamus and is forwarded on to the cerebrum, because the thalamus acts as an information filter of all this information. The hypothalamus is in the anterior and inferior region of the diencephalon. There are several functions of the hypothalamus that serve as a very important regulatory control center for the autonomic nervous system, where this helps to influence heart rate, blood pressure, digestive activities, and respiration. It is also the master control center of the endocrine system, where it oversees most of the system's functions, and so it secretes secretory activities in the anterior pituitary gland. And so metabolism, growth, stress response, and reproduction are all going to be controlled by the hypothalamus. Also, the hypothalamus produces two hormones, and they are the antidiuretic hormone, which reduces water loss at the kidneys, and oxytocin, which stimulates smooth muscle contractions in the uterus, mammary glands, and prostate gland. Also helps to regulate, the hypothalamus also helps to regulate body temperature, and so it's considered to be the body's thermostat. The hypothalamus controls emotional behavior because it's found at the center of the limbic system, and so it's involved in emotional responses like pleasure, aggression, fear, rage, contentment, and sex drive. Also, the hypothalamus controls food intake, which monitors the levels of nutrients like glucose and amino acids in the blood and helps to produce the sensation of hunger. The hypothalamus controls water intake by monitoring how the blood solute concentrations are at within the body. And so if we have high solute concentrations, this helps to stimulate an increase in intake of fluid and the production of antidiuretic hormone. And then we have the regulation of the sleep cycle or circadian rhythms that are regulated by the hypothalamus that work directly with the pineal gland to secrete melatonin. The pituitary gland lies inferior to the hypothalamus and is a small, slightly oval gland that is housed within the fossa of the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. The pituitary gland is also separated into an anterior region and a posterior region, and so commonly referred to as the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland. And based on that, it also serves as different hormones that are secreted based on the location of the gland. The brainstem connects the prosencephalon and the cerebellum to the spinal cord. It contains three regions. We have the mesencephalon, which is the most superior, the pons, which is in the middle, and then the medulla oblongata, which will be the inferiormost region. The brainstem has a bidirectional passageway for all tracts that extend between the cerebrum and the spinal cord. And it also contains many autonomic centers and reflex centers that are required for our survival, and it houses the nuclei of many of the cranial nerves. On the posterior region of the mesencephalon, there are two pairs of sensory nuclei, which are the corpora quadrigemina. And so these nuclei are relay stations in the processing pathway of visual and auditory sensations. So we have the superior colliculi, and these are the superior nuclei, and they are involved in the visual reflex centers because they help to track visual movements of objects and control reflexes, such as turning the eyes and the head in the response to a visual stimulus. The paired inferior colliculi are the auditory reflex centers, where they control the reflexive turning of the head and eyes in the direction of a sound. Also within the mesencephalon, we find the cerebral peduncles, and these are like little feet, and they kind of look like the cupcake liner of a cupcake. And these are motor tracts that are located on the anterior and lateral surface of the mesencephalon. This is where we find somatic motor axons that project inferiorly from the primary motor cortex through the peduncles and then to the spinal cord. The middle portion of the brainstem is the pons, and this is a bulging region that is found on the anterior side. Here there are sensory and motor tracts that connect the brain and the spinal cord, where there are two autonomic respiratory centers that are involved in regulation of the rate and depth of breathing and can influence the activity of the respiratory centers found in the medulla oblongata. The pons houses sensory and motor cranial nerve nuclei of the trigeminal nerve, which is cranial nerve number 5, the abducens nerve, which is cranial nerve number 6, and the facial nerve, which is cranial nerve number 7. And also there are some nuclei for the vestibular cochlear cranial nerve, which is cranial nerve number 8. The medulla oblongata is going to be the most inferior part of the brainstem, and it is continuous with the spinal cord inferiorly. All communication between the brain and the spinal cord involves tracts that ascend or descend through the medulla oblongata. We find the cranial nerve nuclei that are associated with the medulla oblongata are the vestibular cochlear nerve, which is cranial nerve number 8, the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is cranial nerve number 9, the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve number 10, the accessory nerve, which is cranial nerve number 11, and then the hypoglossal nerve, which is cranial nerve number 12. Within the medulla oblongata, there are several autonomic nuclei that are found and are important for life. And so for the cardiac center, we find that it regulates the heart rate and the strength and contraction of the heart. The vasomotor center, which helps to regulate blood pressure, and the respiratory center, which helps to regulate the respiratory rate. Other nuclei that are found within the medulla oblongata include coughing, sneezing, salivating, swallowing, gagging, and vomiting. The cerebellum lies posterior to the pons and the medulla oblongata of the brainstem, and it is the second largest part of the brain. The cerebellum is composed of a left and right cerebellar hemisphere, and along the midline, a narrow band of cortex known as the vermis separates the left and the right cerebellar hemispheres. The vermis receives sensory input reporting torso position and balance, and so it helps with maintaining our balance. There is an outer gray matter layer of cortex, an internal region of white matter, and the deepest gray matter layer is composed of the cerebellar nuclei. The white matter of the cerebellum is called the arbor vitae, and this is because it looks like branches of a tree. The cerebellum coordinates and fine-tunes skeletal muscle movements and ensures that skeletal muscle contractions follow the correct pattern, leading to smooth coordinated movements. Also, the cerebellum stores memories of previously learned movement patterns. The limbic system is composed of multiple cerebral and diencephalic structures that collaboratively process and experience emotions. The limbic system is involved in motivation, emotion, and memory with the emotional association. And so the limbic system affects memory information by integrating past memories of physical sensations with emotional states. For the structures of the limbic system, we have the hippocampus, which connects the diencephalon by a structure called the fornix. And this nucleus is shaped like a seahorse and is essential for storing memories and forming long-term memory. The fornix is a thin tract of white matter that connects the hippocampus with other Diencephalon limbic system structures. The cingulate gyrus is an internal mass of cerebral cortex that is found within the longitudinal fissure and superior to the corpus callosum. It's only seen in the sagittal section, and it completely surrounds the diencephalon. It receives input from other components of the limbic system, and it focuses attention on emotionally significant events and appears to bring them into consciousness. And then lastly, the septum lucidum is going to be a thin medial partition that separates the two lateral ventricles. Cerebrovascular accidents, or CVAs, are typically referred to as strokes, and a lot of them are due to ischemia, which decreases the amount of blood and oxygen that circulates to the brain. So the amount of severity and dysfunction that occurs for the brain depends on how much blood flow has been restricted. And so this is a condition that kills 150,000 Americans each year, and a lot of this is influenced by lifestyle. So obesity and diabetes tend to be associated with high levels of CVAs. With Alzheimer's disease, this is due to senile plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, which are important for rapid deterioration of the brain. And so what happens is that these neurofibrillary tangles, they form all of these crosslinks where neuron conduction cannot happen, and so you actually get a result of brain death that occurs due to the neurons dying off. And then the plaques are also associated with beta amyloid, which has an accumulation within the brain and is a fatty substance. And so this is the fourth leading cause of death in adults, where typically people aren't diagnosed with Alzheimer's until about 65 years of age. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, as it's commonly known, is a problem with our motor neurons within our spinal cord, and this is where we actually have death of the motor neurons. With this disease, this tends to lead to skeletal muscle atrophy because of the death of the motor neurons. And then one of the last things, or last areas to go, are the neurons that innervate the diaphragm. And typically this is diagnosed around 40 years of age, where death usually occurs 2 to 5 years after diagnosis. Multiple sclerosis, this is an autoimmune disease that has degradation of the myelin sheath that surrounds axons. And so we have a decrease in conduction where there is a lot of pain that is associated with the death of the myelin sheath around different axons and neurons. Or ALS. Parkinson's disease is a slow-progressing neurological condition that affects muscle movement and balance. Parkinson's patients have a stiff posture, an expressionless face, slow voluntary movements, a resting tremor that usually is exhibited in the hands, where it starts in one hand and then goes to both, and then a shuffling gait. This is due to a decrease in the neurotransmitter of dopamine found within the neurons of the substantia nigra. So typically, when individuals have lost 80 to 90% of the dopaminergic neurons, this is where they start to exhibit symptoms of Parkinson's. Cranial nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system, and they originate on the interior or inferior surface of the brain. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves that are numbered according to their position, beginning with the most anteriorly placed nerve. For the functions of the cranial nerves, we'll go through them. So cranial nerve number 1 is the olfactory nerve, and so it is primarily sensory nerve that is responsible for smell. Cranial nerve number 2 is the optic nerve, which is a sensory nerve responsible for vision. Cranial nerve number 3 is the oculomotor nerve, which is a motor nerve that is responsible for movement of eye muscles. Cranial nerve number 4, which is the trochlear nerve, is a motor nerve that is also responsible for movement of the eye muscles, and specifically for just one type of the superior oblique eye muscles. The cranial nerve number 5 is the trigeminal nerve, which is both sensory and motor nerve, and so the sensory portion for the face, and then the motor portion for the jaw. Cranial nerve number 6 is the abducens nerve, which is a motor nerve that is responsible for movement of the eye muscles, which is in particular the lateral rectus eye muscles. Cranial nerve number 7 is the facial nerve, which is both a sensory and a motor nerve, and so for sensation of taste, and then for the motor movement of the face and multiple glands. Cranial nerve number 8 is the vestibular cochlear nerve, which is a sensory nerve that helps with sensation of hearing as well as equilibrium. The cranial nerve number 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve, is both a sensory and motor nerve, and responsible for motor movement of salivary glands and then sensations within the tongue. Cranial nerve number 10 is the vagus nerve, and so this is both sensory and motor nerve. So motor movement of the pharynx and larynx, and then sensation of the pharynx and larynx, as well as the heart and the viscera. Then we have cranial nerve number 11, which is the accessory nerve, which is a motor nerve and helps with movement of different neck muscles and the soft palate, such as the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid. And then cranial nerve number 12, which is also a motor nerve and is the hypoglossal nerve, where it has movement for the tongue muscles. Different functions between the left and the right hemispheres include that the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, as it controls written and spoken language, as well as numerical and scientific skills, as well as reasoning. The right cerebral hemisphere controls the left side of the body and is involved in controlling musical and artistic awareness, spatial and pattern perception, as well as insight and imagination.